Their home was bigger than any of us expected. Lucas didn't talk about his family much since moving. He mentioned once they were geologists, biologists, an ist of some kind. We didn't expect wealth or opulence. He had been giving me handwritten notes and printed out pamphlets for a few weeks, speaking of the end times and religious ramblings. My family gathered around to read them each time. My father said he ran into the parents one day after school, and accepted an invitation to go over for a day. We were shocked, but he said they were lovely, normal even, and he was also a bit curious. My father made an offhanded joke about them as we pulled up. My mother reflexively slapped his shoulder with the back of her hand. Looking up from her phone and waving to the family standing on the front porch. "They're just different, be open," she said, trotting down the front stairs towards us. Miss Collier pulled me into a hug so tight I thought my head would pop off. I didn't hear her first name. Miss Collier it was. His father, Mr. Collier, was the opposite. He waved loosely from the porch. He might not have even waved. Just watched from the doorway before retreating back inside. Miss Collier brushed it off. "He's just quiet," she stressed. My mother said something about how much of a hike to school it must be for them, living this far out. The house was impressive, if sterile and cold. Like walking through the halls of a museum. It was like a holiday house, the bare essentials. Their lives seemed as empty as the home, not talking about themselves or their work much. I could tell this was going to be a one and done with this family. My parents went off with the Colliers to see the house, leaving my sister and I standing silently with Lucas. She scurried off, setting up on a couch somewhere with her headphones in. Lucas and I stood in the silence for a moment too long. He didn't say anything but gestured for me to follow him. Passing a row of framed portraits above the fireplace, I asked who they were. He ignored me till I asked again a bit louder. He said he didn't know. I couldn't wait to leave. I couldn't imagine what this boy did outside of school. I tried hard to picture him having fun with his family, playing video games, sneaking a cigarette. I couldn't, just a void, just alone in a void until required to go out in the world, in his bedroom. Bedroom is a stretch, keeping with the rest of the house. There were no pictures, or toys, or anything showing a young boy lived here. He said they hadn't gotten around to unpacking all his things since the move. I had a hard time believing him. Still early in the day, I watched in relative silence alongside my sister and Lucas as our parents drilled through every interest of theirs to try and find common ground. My parents owned a fish and chip shop off the beach. Neither were prepared to connect with two scientists and their beliefs. Ms. Collier poured a round of drinks, loosen everyone up maybe, and put the glass bottle back into the oddly empty fridge. She brought my sister and me a glass. She told us she didn't mind, and wouldn't tell our parents. My sister downed the glass straight away. I followed her lead. Over the day, Ms. Collier fed us glass after glass as I dodged any interaction with her son. Later I stumbled, breaking a glass. My mother joked that I'd had too much. Did she know? It felt like a joke. I got a brief moment with my parents, huddling to talk. My dad joked, mentioning he was going on a hunt to figure out who these people were, joking about a dungeon or something. Fading in and out of focus, sipping at my glass, I watched Mr. Collier lectured incessantly as Miss Collier chimed in from time to time in an attempt to simplify him. Even in my state, my mind wandering off out of the room again and again, I could pick the strain and awkwardness on my parents' faces, nodding away. Mr. Collier began to get boisterous, louder. Getting onto his feet again and again. I watched him trip, landing a heavy hand on my father's chair to steady himself but bringing both to the ground. My father's wrist was tangled under the chair leg, twisted at a grotesque angle. We all crowded around, looking between each other unsure what to do. My father assured everyone he was fine. But Mr. Collier eventually convinced everyone he would drive my father to the hospital. He was sober, and had been since the 90s, he bragged. We spent the afternoon by the pool, a bit shocked and a bit drunk. I took my phone out to take a photo of the mountain range. Through the house, I could see my mother and Ms. Collier floating between rooms, looking like they were almost yelling. They could be laughing maybe, hands flying about. Before I could press the button, I was underwater. It took a few moments to get myself up for air, the alcohol tearing away my coordination. Wiping my eyes, I saw Lucas standing at the edge. This asshole had shoulder charged me into the pool. As a joke. He had a grin. Forced. I pulled myself out and pulled off my wet clothes. Ms. Collier appeared at the door without my mother. She scolded Lucas, who stormed off. My phone was soaked through, rapidly clicking the button showed nothing but black. Ms. Collier was chuckling, downplaying the situation. She asked my sister to help her find some towels. I pulled myself up out of the water. The sun felt sharper, hotter than before. I hadn't eaten or drank water in hours, my guts feeling twister in a knot. I waddled on wet, shaky legs towards the house, the back door drifting to the corners of my vision again and again. Behind some empty containers in the pantry, I found a small bag of rice. I took a small tub, filled it with rice and threw my phone in. The house was quiet. I held the tub under my arm. Standing still, I focused as hard as I could to still my heart. I tiptoed around the house, steadying myself against the cool walls. I remember wandering towards Lucas' bedroom. I found him with head in his hands. I chuckled. Why did I do that? I was still buzzed, cupping my hand over my mouth. He looked up, eyes red. I dropped down on his bed. We talked for a bit. He talked to me for a bit and I tried as hard as I could to keep both my eyes open and blinking together. I took in every couple of words, but I could see he was serious. Without me realizing, he was standing up, next to the bed, looked down at me. He asked if I believed. I threw up in my mouth a bit, the acid stinging my throat. Believe what? He had been talking about the notes he had been giving me for weeks. I laughed, still a bit buzzed, accidentally telling him how we read and joked about them around the dinner table. I had to believe, he said. I was getting hot, I could feel my face getting red. He lunged forward and grabbed my shirt, pulling me up off the bed. Spit flying in my face, he was yelling at me now, that I was chosen and I would see. His words floating in my head, mixing with the alcohol, blurring it all together. I chuckled again. I didn't believe what was happening. Ms. Collier was chuckling, downplaying the situation. She asked my sister to help her find some towels. I pulled myself up out of the water. The sun felt sharper, hotter than before. I hadn't eaten or drank water in hours, my guts feeling twister in a knot. I waddled on wet, shaky legs towards the house, the back door drifting to the corners of my vision again and again. Behind some empty containers in the pantry, I found a small bag of rice. I took a small tub, filled it with rice and threw my phone in. The house was quiet. I held the tub under my arm. Standing still, I focused as hard as I could to still my heart. I tiptoed around the house, steadying myself against the cool walls. I remember wandering towards Lucas' bedroom. I found him with head in his hands. I chuckled. Why did I do that? I was still buzzed, cupping my hand over my mouth. He looked up, eyes red. I dropped down on his bed. We talked for a bit. He talked to me for a bit and I tried as hard as I could to keep both my eyes open and blinking together. I took in every couple of words, but I could see he was serious. Without me realizing, he was standing up, next to the bed, looked down at me. He asked if I believed. I threw up in my mouth a bit, the acid stinging my throat. Believe what? He had been talking about the notes he had been giving me for weeks. I laughed, still a bit buzzed, accidentally telling him how we read and joked about them around the dinner table. I had to believe, he said. I was getting hot, I could feel my face getting red. He lunged forward and grabbed my shirt, pulling me up off the bed. Spit flying in my face, he was yelling at me now, that I was chosen and I would see. His words floating in my head, mixing with the alcohol, blurring it all together. I chuckled again. I didn't believe what was happening. Not disconnected. No answer either. After it rang out, I scrolled and found my father's. It rang as well. I could hear the ringing. I could hear the buzz of the vibration. Could I hear it? I could feel it. I lifted each of my feet up off the grass. I could feel it through the dirt. I slowly got down onto all fours. My phone is still ringing in my hand. I pressed my head slowly down onto the grass. The vibration now shook my ear. I could hear it vibrating up through the dirt. Ms. Collier's voice echoed out from the back door. Silhouetted against the house lights, she asked me to come inside. Once calmly. When I didn't move, she raised her voice. I looked back out towards the range. The hills rolled off towards civilization. There's no way I could run that far. I turned and walked towards the back of the house. It was quiet inside. The lights were off, only the shine of the living room light creeping around the house. I walked slowly, Miss Collier's hand on my shoulder guiding me towards the light. The living room was a mess. The dining table was dragged to the window and there was glass on the floor. I saw my sister. She was sitting in a dining chair in the middle of the room. She looked asleep. But she was moving. I could see her wrist struggling against something. A rope? Mr. Collier appeared at my shoulder. He had his hand gripped tight. I could feel my collarbone bend under his grip. He could snap it clean if he tried. Lucas arrived next to me, wincing. Ms. Collier walked back in the room, snapped on a pair of latex gloves and pulled a nauseating-looking syringe out of a small wooden box. The vial was filled with a thick black liquid. My sister struggled as she rolled her sleeve up past her elbow. Mr. Collier let go of my shoulder and came over to hold her forearm still with his weight. Lucas stepped up next to me. I could see he had a small steak knife in his hand. A dark black ring had grown around his eye. Ms. Collier slowly pierced the metal needle into a pulsing vein right beneath her bicep. She drew a bit of blood, mixing with the liquid, turning it a deep crimson. She slowly pushed the end of the syringe down, pushing the liquid into her arm. They both stepped back. It was silent. Silent for what felt like hours. When she snapped her chest up violently, my sister managed to break the wooden back frame of the chair. Mr. Collier rushed back over with his son to hold her down. She eventually stopped, head dropping low in her chest. Ms. Collier threw the syringe and gloves down hard onto the table in disappointment. Mr. Collier let out a long sigh. He took a moment, rubbed the bridge of his nose, and turned towards me. Lucas wrapped his forearm around my throat and pulled me backwards. I was immediately off balance, no footing to push or fight back. He dragged me down as the two adults rushed over and helped pull me over to the other intact dining chair. They tied each of my limbs to the chair, unable to put up much of a fight. She whispered in my ear as she tied my arms down, hoping I could be their vessel. They'd hoped my sister would be the one to carry their voice. Their son had liked me, and wanted a friend on the other side, she said. Stroking the back of my head, she told me to have no fear, they come in peace. She held the tip of the needle close to my skin. The end started to shake. Was she nervous? My chair was shaking. The whole room seemed to be shaking. They both leaned back. I watched the picture frames above the fireplace drop, one by one, onto the hard floor. Plates flew off the dining table, shattering. I saw Ms. Collier's eyes widen. There early she whispered to her husband. He looked, perplexed. Not stunned from a sudden earthquake, but confused that it had happened. He was expecting it. I could hear the walls and windows fighting to stay upright. Then we all heard the muffled screams. Turning around, I saw my sister in the doorway. She stood still against the shaking walls. She was taking long, painful-looking breaths. Letting go of his neck, Lucas dropped in a heap at her feet. His eyes winced, but the ability to move or speak had been broken. Mr. Collier stood up and in one motion, rushed towards her with his hands raised. Paternal instinct. I watched them scuffle. Even at half his height and weight, she put up a loose but even fight. I saw her arm snap under his weight. I saw his shock as she kept moving, swinging the arm like a mace, no pain or fear. I saw her eyes then. Black. Glassy. She dug her teeth hard into his arm, tearing a chunk off and spitting it out. He pulled back, just enough of an opening for her to grab a shard off a broken plate that had fallen and ram it hard up beneath his jaw. The force must have scrambled something inside because I watched one of his eyes bulge out of its socket. They both looked off in different directions. His face was a grimace. She slid the shard back out and he toppled back into a side table. She turned to Miss Collier and me, still strapped to the chair. I could see the tears run down the mother's cheeks, but her face didn't change. She started to hobble forward towards my sister, slowly getting down on all fours. When she reached my sister, she was nearly flat on the ground, head down and arms outstretched. Groveling. I couldn't hear what she was saying. My sister knelt down to her level. She put a hand under the mother's chin and lifted her head up to meet her gaze. They stared at each other for a moment. There is nothing here for us. This planet is poisoned. The water, the soil. You have lied. It was my sister's voice, but she sounded like she had never spoken before. Like she was forcing her throat and face muscles together for the first time. It was guttural. Filthy. I finally heard the mother. She was sputtering, but I could make out a few words. Please, she was saying, again and again. She said she didn't know. She was saying that they were wrong. That it could be fixed. I noticed her neck was getting red. Getting compressed. I saw the muscle in my sister's working arm flexing. Over the struggling breaths, I could hear the mother begging harder and harder. Apologizing. Saying she could help them, she could fix everything. Eventually she stopped. I heard a crack, like stepping on a branch. The mother dropped down, back into her groveling heap. Standing up, my sister looked at me again. She slowly walked over. Leaning down, I saw into her eyes. Nothing. All I saw was myself. Staring back. I finally saw how I looked. I have never seen that face before. I looked empty, drained of all fear. She placed the point of the plate shard against my neck. Slowly, she dragged it down my neck, over my shoulder and down my arm. Without taking her eyes off me, she slid the shard under the restraint and cut them open. She dropped the shard. Staring at me, the black of her eyes faded. It wasn't my sister's eyes looking back. No blue or green. Just a wash of gray. She wasn't there. Nothing was there. She stood upright, her legs gave way, and she crashed backwards onto the ground. Pulling myself out of the chair, feeling full of cement, I rubbed my wrists and looked around. I stumbled to the front door. Beyond the trees, I could see a pair of headlights coming towards the house. I sat down on the front steps and closed my eyes.